Welcome to the Deep Dives. Today we're really tearing open what some sources call the operating manual of American division.
That's right. The core idea we're exploring is that a lot of the political and economic friction we see isn't just happening by chance.
It's described more like a strategy,
Yeah.
almost like a playbook, centuries old, designed to distract.
Exactly. Specifically to distract people, particularly working people, with this illusion of racial hierarchy while, the powerful consolidate wealth and control.
And the key term our sources keep returning to is the psychological wage, this sort of invisible reward or maybe weight of division that people carry.
Yeah, it's this idea of getting a status boost, however small or symbolic, just for belonging to the right group, even if your actual economic situation isn't improving. Our mission today is tracing that.
Okay, so we're going deep,
Yeah.
cracking the psychological operation, this maybe psychological warfare, as some sources frame it.
I think that's fair. We need to go back centuries to see not just what happened, but why these patterns got locked in and why they still arguably shape so much debate today.
So where do we start? What's the ground zero for this, according to the material?
Well, the sources consistently point to a really specific moment. Bacon's Rebellion, back in 1676.
1676, okay.
Huh?
And what was so critical about that event?
It's seen as the trigger. Before Bacon's Rebellion, the lines were apparently much blurrier.
How so?
You had black and white indentured servants, enslaved Africans, even some free black people, basically stuck in similar conditions of brutal exploitation by the wealthy planter class.
So they shared a common economic misery.
Precisely. And because of that shared misery, they sometimes worked together, socialized together, and crucially, they rebelled together. Bacon's Rebellion itself involved both black and white participants united against the colonial governor and the elite.
That image, black and white poor folks fighting side by side against the rich, that must have terrified the establishment.
Utterly terrified them. The sources describe it as an existential threat. If that kind of cross-racial working-class solidarity took hold, their whole system of extracting wealth was, well, finished.
So they needed a way to break that alliance permanently.
Yes. And their solution was, frankly, diabolical and transformative. They didn't just crush the rebellion militarily, they fundamentally restructured society.
How?
Two main things happened almost simultaneously, according to this analysis. First, they hardened the lines of slavery, making it explicitly based on race and heredity for people of African descent. Chattel slavery, as we often think of it, really began to codify then.
Okay. Formalizing race-based slavery, what was the second part?
They essentially invented the concept of whiteness as a formal legal and social category, granting poor Europeans specific privileges because they were white.
Wait, invented whiteness? How does that work?
Well, people were English, Irish, Scottish, etc. The idea of a unified white identity superior to all non-whites was actively constructed. Poor white people who were still poor were suddenly given new rights.
Like what? What changed for them practically?
They got the right to own guns, sometimes small plots of land, the right to serve on patrols, essentially police-like authority over black people, and their testimony mattered in court against black individuals, things that were previously denied or limited.
Ah, so it wasn't just a feeling, it was tangible legal status. They got a pass on their poverty, social step up, purely based on skin color.
Exactly. That's the first payment of the psychological wage. It cost the planter elite virtually nothing economically. They didn't raise wages or shorten indentures significantly.
But it gave the poor white person a reason, a powerful status-based reason, to identify with the rich white planter instead of the black laborer standing next to him.
Precisely. It broke the solidarity. It was, as one source puts it, the original picking his pocket by distracting him with the illusion of racial rank, a zero-cost solution to maintain hierarchy.
Chilling. And the impact on the enslaved population must have been devastating, doesn't even cover it.
It was catastrophic. That potential for collective action, for maybe finding common ground with other poor workers, that door just slammed shut.
They were legally defined as fundamentally other, inherently inferior, isolated.
Yes, leading to generations of forced separation, dehumanization, the destruction of families. A profound foundational trauma.
Okay, so that's the origin story of this division strategy. Fast forward. Slavery ends after the Civil War.
Yeah.
Does the strategy just disappear?
Not at all, according to the sources. It just changed clothes. The legal framework of slavery was gone, but the need to maintain the hierarchy and prevent working-class unity remained.
So it adapted. How?
It morphed into the system of Jim Crow, and it's really crucial to understand Jim Crow not just as segregated facilities like water fountains or schools, though that was part of it.
It would be bigger than that.
Much bigger. The sources describe Jim Crow as a massive psychological operation. Every law, every custom, every threat of violence was designed to constantly reinforce the racial hierarchy.
Let's break that down. For Black Americans, what was the psychological impact of Jim Crow?
Constant grinding humiliation, daily reminders of being considered second class, unworthy, segregation, voter suppression, economic exploitation through sharecropping, the constant threat of violence, lynching.
It was terror, essentially, designed to enforce submission.
Absolutely. The message hammered home relentlessly was, you are not worthy, you do not belong. This, the sources argue, created deep community trauma, a sense of pervasive unworthiness.
And that's where that cultural mandate sometimes arises, right? The pressure to be twice as good just to get half as far.
Exactly. A coping mechanism born from intense systemic pressure and the constant need to prove one's humanity and worth against overwhelming denial.
Wait, so that's the impact on Black Americans. What about poor white Americans under Jim Crow? The strategy still needed them.
Yes, and for them, Jim Crow continued to pay out that psychological wage. They were often still economically exploited, terrible wages, sharecropping debt, company stores. But the system constantly whispered, at least you aren't Black. That was their compensation. That fragile status, that sense of belonging to the superior group, was their primary comfort.
The social safety net of whiteness, as some put it.
That's the phrase used. It gave them a floor, a minimum dignity, even in poverty. And it taught them, generation after generation, to see their Black neighbors not as potential allies facing similar economic struggles,
But as threats. Threats to their jobs, their communities, their fragile status.
Precisely. The anger that might have been directed upwards towards the economic system exploiting them both was carefully channeled sideways, fueled by racial anxiety.
So the strategy, in effect, psychologically chained both groups.
In different ways, yes. One group chained to terror and systemic disadvantage, the other chained to a kind of blinding, fragile superiority that prevented them from seeing their own economic interests clearly.
It's a powerful, self-perpetuating system of distraction.
And the argument is that while the civil rights movement tore down the legal walls of Jim Crow, many of the psychological walls are still standing.
Which brings us to today. How do the sources argue this playbook, this psychological strategy, operates now in the 21st century? Does it still exist?
Oh, absolutely. The sources contend we're living right in the middle of it. The tactics are just updated for modern media and politics. The core strategy, they argue, is identical.
Okay, so what does the modern playbook look like? What are the steps?
It generally follows a three-step pattern, according to this analysis. Step 1. Introduce a potent bogeyman, usually framed in racial or cultural terms.
Example.
Well, the sources point to things like stoking fears about immigrants or focusing intensely on cultural flashpoints like how history is taught. The debates around critical race theory are often cited as a recent example. Anything that creates an us versus them based on identity.
Okay, create a scapegoat, generate fear or grievance. Step 2.
Step 2. Rally a segment of the population, often, though not exclusively, white working-class voters who might feel economically insecure or culturally displaced around this perceived threat.
So you mobilize people based on protecting their status or identity rather than focusing on shared economic concerns.
Exactly. You make the cultural or racial threat seem paramount, and then comes step 3, which is the economic core of the maneuver.
Which is?
While everyone is distracted and polarized by the bogeyman, policymakers often pass legislation that disproportionately benefits the wealthy and powerful.
Like tax cuts skewed towards the top, deregulation, policies that might weaken labor unions.
Not precisely. Things that might actually hurt the economic prospects of the very people who were mobilized by the cultural grievance in step 2.
Yeah.
The pocket picking continues, just wrapped in different rhetoric.
The distraction allows the wealth transfer to happen relatively unnoticed, or at least undebated on economic terms.
That's the core argument. The psychological wage is still being paid, or at least offered, to distract from the economic realities.
This raises the question of the internal cost. How does carrying this history, this psychological weight, affect people internally today?
The sources highlight a couple of key areas. For some Black Americans, there's the concept of inherited trauma manifesting as internalized racism.
What does that look like?
It can surface in things like colorism within the community, prejudice based on skin tone, or struggles with self-doubt, or even just the sheer exhaustion of constantly code switching.
Can you explain code switching quickly?
Sure. It's the often mentally taxing process of adjusting your speech, your mannerisms, your appearance to fit into the dominant, often white cultural context, usually in professional or public settings.
To avoid negative judgment or stereotypes.
Exactly. It's managing perceptions constantly, which is the direct legacy of being systematically devalued. It's exhausting mental labor.
Okay, and what about the other side of that coin? The legacy for, say, working class white Americans.
There, the sources point to what we could call working class misdirection. The pattern persists, where economic anxiety gets channeled into racial or cultural resentment.
So, still focusing anger on scapegoated groups, immigrants, minorities, cultural elites, whatever the bogeyman of the moment is.
Rather than on the, economic forces, the concentration of wealth and power, that might actually be the primary drivers of wage stagnation or job insecurity. They're still, in a sense, protecting that psychological wage, that feeling of status, sometimes even against their own clear economic self-interest.
The continuity is pretty staggering when you lay it out like that. After
Oh.
1676 through Jim Crow to today's political climate.
It's presented as a remarkably consistent strategy of division and distraction, perfected over centuries.
So wrapping this up for you, the listener,
Hmm.
why does understanding this, recognizing this pattern of the psychological wage, actually matter today?
Because, according to these sources, if you don't recognize the game, you can't understand the playing field. Decoding modern politics and economic debates becomes much clearer when you see this historical strategy potentially operating underneath.
It helps you see why certain issues get amplified, why certain groups get scapegoated, and importantly, who benefits when working people are divided against each other.
Right. And the sources suggest that the path towards, well, healing or fundamental change requires a kind of radical clarity. It means needing to recognize the distraction tactics and actively call them out.
And what's the proposed solution, or the way forward, suggested by this analysis?
It comes back full circle, really. The sources argue the only way to truly break these psychological chains is to finally build the very thing the power structure has apparently feared since 1676.
Which is?
A genuine, broad-based, cross-racial alliance of working people. An alliance focused on shared economic interests, capable of challenging concentrated power.
That's the final provocative thought then. If the original sin, so to speak, was the deliberate shattering of that potential solidarity, maybe the ultimate solution lies in finally consciously rebuilding it. What power could be unleashed if that alliance actually formed? Something to consider.